Hi, my name is Madeline, and I'm a staff correspondent for the Columbia Political Review, a multi-partisan political publication at Columbia University aiming to encourage political discourse. Today, I'm here with Katy Bass, the research director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, which serves to defend First Amendment rights by supporting legal cases, conducting research, and advocating for free expression. Ms. Glenn Bass has extensive experience working with issues regarding First Amendment rights and freedom of speech, beginning this work after graduating from Harvard Law when she worked in Fordham and NYU's law schools in the International Human Rights Clinic and Center for Constitutional Transitions, respectively. In 2016, she worked with PEN America, an organization dedicated to protecting free speech for journalists. She currently works as the research director of the Knight First Institute, where she has organized several symposia examining how discussions surrounding free speech have evolved in the modern day. So, Ms. Glenn Bass, you're currently working as the research director of the Knight Institute, but you began working to protect freedom of expression with PEN America, a nonprofit that defends free speech and press with a focus on writers and journalists in 2014. How has the conversation regarding free speech changed over time in your experience? Do you feel like progress has been made in the fight for First Amendment rights?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Madeline. It's nice to be talking to you. So I would say things that have changed since 2014 are that the prominence of First Amendment issues and free speech issues globally has increased a lot in terms of salience. It seems in some ways that almost every political fight we're having in this country relates to free speech in some way. So I think the importance of free speech rights and the value of free expression has become more apparent over those years. In terms of whether there has been progress made, I mean, I think we're really in a battle for the soul of the Constitution right now. So progress is a hard thing to describe, but I would say that I think people are really aware of how important these rights are, both for themselves and for our society more broadly.
Okay, thank you so much. So, with the Knight Institute, you've put together multiple research initiatives focusing on recent technological developments, such as platform algorithms and artificial intelligence. This new technology has drastically changed the nature of public discourse, and it will continue to change the way people continue to discuss politics in the future. Do you feel like technology has allowed for greater freedom of expression, or alternatively, has technology hindered freedom of expression in other ways?
This is a complicated question because I think everyone is very aware right now of the harms that new technologies are posing to free expression. And, if you asked this question 10 or 15 years ago, I think you would have gotten much more optimistic answers from people who work on this. There was a lot of hope that the internet and sort of global connectivity was going to bring about like a new wave of democracy and free speech around the world. And now we're sort of seeing the bottom of that cycle where everyone now thinks that technology is enabling authoritarianism and, sending us into the darkness. And there's some truth to both of those things. But I would say that one thing that I think technology has been really wonderful for in terms of free expression is in dramatically expanding people's access to information and their ability to inform themselves and to listen to people from anywhere in the world in a way that really just was not possible before the internet. And I share people's concerns about some of the side effects of these new technologies, but I also still think it's been a really enormous development in terms of people's ability to organize, to learn from one another, to find information that they might want to explore on their own, that the internet has ushered in.
And in your experience, how have these technological developments changed the way that scholars view and debate constitutional issues?
One thing that has really changed the way we talk about speech is that so much of our speech now happens on privately owned platforms. So, as you know, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were primarily written with the government in mind as the chief source of danger to those rights, which makes sense because the internet did not exist in the 18th century. But all of those rights and sort of the court framework that has been built up around those rights is really thinking about the government as the problem, the government as the infringer of rights. And now we have this new environment where almost everything we do to communicate um, is happening on platforms owned by companies, not by the government. And those companies' decisions have real impact on our freedom of speech and our ability to express ourselves, but they're not government actions. So in some ways, the First Amendment doesn't have a lot of work to do there. But then you also now have this second layer to look at where the government is trying to influence what those companies do, and it's putting pressure on them to take down certain speech or not take down certain speech, or criticizing them for being biased towards one political view or another. So it has really actually changed a lot about the way we think about, where the threats to free speech are coming from and what can be done about them.
Yeah, and on the topic of the responsibility of these private platforms, the issue of misinformation on social media has been a highly debated topic in recent years. While some feel as though social media platforms bear the responsibility of fact-checking and limiting the spread of false information, others argue that this would pose a threat to freedom of speech. This debate has even culminated in legal challenges, such as in Murphy versus Missouri, where Missouri and Louisiana sued the U.S. government for having social media platforms remove posts related to the pandemic. What role do you believe social media platforms play in enforcing the accuracy of information?
Well, I think there's two things to consider here. One is the role they should play in terms of their social responsibility or their responsibility to their users, what the users of that platform want them to be doing. And the other category to think about is how effective they are at actually doing that. And those are not the same question. They don't necessarily lead to the same answer. So I would say that on most platforms, users would prefer that the platform be doing something to try to remove inaccurate information, at least about, really important things like public health messaging, the efficacy of vaccines, things like that. Um, and that's what the Murphy case was about in part. And I think most users don't like thinking of the social media platforms they use as vectors of mis and disinformation. We've also seen, though, for many years that platforms that have tried to make an effort to do this, there was more of this in the past. I think most platforms have now sort of stepped back from the idea that they should be really policing the factual nature of information on their platforms, but their ability to do that, I think, is more questionable. The amount of information that's being posted on these platforms and shared on these platforms every second is really hard for the human brain to even fathom. Like, it's just so much information. And so I think what we have seen is that they're really limited in their capabilities to do a good job of that, even if that's a role that we want them to play. Like, just the technological realities of these platforms makes it pretty hard for them to do that accurately. Like, they can either overshoot and they take down too much stuff, including stuff that I think most people would not consider to be factually inaccurate, or they undershoot and they leave up a lot of stuff, and then people see the stuff on the platform and think, wait, why is that there? That's crazy. So, it's a hard problem.
Do you believe that it's possible to strike some sort of ideal balance between overshooting and kind of not having enough fact checking?
I don't really know. And I honestly think this is one of those things where the users of the platforms are probably the ones best positioned to ask for that, or to use their own ability to exit that platform if they don't like the way it is operating. So to take one example, X as a platform, once Twitter was taken over by Elon Musk, a number of users left the platform because they didn't like the new decisions that were being made by new leadership about content moderation and about the kinds of accounts that they were hosting online. And I'm sympathetic to the fact that there are only so many options on social media. Like, there are not an endless number of platforms to use. But one thing that I think holds promise is newer platforms like Blue Sky, where users have more control over those sorts of moderation decisions themselves in terms of what they want to see and what they don't want to see. Things like that, I think, are probably the way forward.
Thank you. So, beyond the digital sphere, the censorship of free speech has been especially relevant to higher education. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression gives universities speech climate grades to measure free expression on campus, which is based on student surveys, campus policies, and speech-related controversies. Columbia University received an F in speech climate. In your opinion, is this a fair assessment? And what benchmarks would need to be met for this assessment to change?
So I can't really speak to the fire grade because I don't know that much about the methodology they use to come up with those scores. But I think for many campuses across the United States, their record on free expression has been pretty dismal over the last few years in terms of cracking down on particular kinds of expression, and also just in terms of applying rules differently to different speakers or different actors. And that is, I think, the benchmark that I would highlight as one of the most important going forward is for campuses that are private, campuses that are not public universities like a state school. They have a lot of leeway in terms of the law, in terms of what sorts of rules they want to set for expression on campus. But whatever those rules are, I mean, they should be informed by First Amendment values, and they also should be applied fairly and equally across the board. And, if you can't do that, then you deserve the failing grade.
And to what extent do you believe that private universities should have more leeway in managing free speech as opposed to public universities?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's a matter of how much they should have, just because it's a matter of how the First Amendment applies differently to public schools versus private schools. But I think in general, I would say that private schools should look to the principles of the First Amendment in terms of, when you make rules, don't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint or on the basis of content. Apply those rules fairly. Try to maximize free expression values in those rules. You want to try to accommodate as much speech and debate and expression on campus as possible. Those things are all encoded in the First Amendment, and that is where I would point private universities when setting their rules as well.
Okay, great. So while universities are aiming to maintain their academic freedom and allow for pure freedom of expression, they're also facing growing pressures to moderate this expression according to political sentiments. Columbia and other universities have been heavily criticized in recent years for their policies on free speech and agreements with the Trump administration. Do you view educational institutions more as perpetrators of censorship or actors which can lead the fight against it?
Well, I would take a step back and look at where the pressure is coming from because I think, as critical as I have been and the Knight Institute has been of universities that have settled with the administration, I think the thing to really underscore here is that it is entirely inappropriate and unconstitutional for the government to be putting this kind of pressure on universities in the first place. Like, that is the main problem. And particularly because the Trump administration is doing this by withholding federal funding, which is really vital for the massive research apparatuses that exist on most of these campuses. They're putting these universities in a pretty much impossible position. Like, you either have to live with the fact that you may not see that funding for years, even if you fight in court. It may take years to resolve it, and you have to gamble that it will go in your favor, even though I think you do have a strong First Amendment case there. Or you have to bend to the enormous pressure from your own community and from the government to cut a deal with them so that you can get that money back and the university's research operations can continue. That's a completely unfair position to put any university in. One thing that I think has been really unfortunate about the last few months is that so many schools have been really reluctant to press for their rights in court. There have only been a very small number of universities that have tried to sue over this sort of withholding of funding as a lever for pushing you to agree to the administration's terms. I think the First Amendment law is very much in the university's favor in these cases, but courts take a long time to decide issues, and then there's appeals to go through, and most schools can't really live with multiple years of interrupted funding. So, I think they've been put in a really hard place. I would have liked to see more resistance from those universities than for the most part we have seen.
And if we look at patterns spanning across the whole country, there have been numerous cases that suggest that the U.S. may be experiencing democratic backsliding and decreasing the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens. The U.S. was added to the Civicus Monitor Watch List, which is a list of countries that have experienced decreased civil liberties. Do you feel like this claim rings true regarding the current state of rights in the U.S.?
Yes, unfortunately, I think it does. And it's also something that, many scholars of democracy and authoritarianism have noted as well, that we're clearly in a moment of backsliding.
Can you elaborate on more what this backsliding looks like in the US?
Well, it's this onslaught against all sorts of speech as well as sites of opposition to the administration. One reason they are going after universities is because universities are a site where effective resistance to some of what they're trying to do would form. But you're also seeing it in terms of their attempt to bring pressure on all sorts of private institutions, the attacks on the media and the frivolous lawsuits against major media outlets that those outlets have then decided to settle rather than fight in court where their First Amendment rights would have been vindicated. It's really across the board, this sort of attempt to superimpose an authoritarian power structure on our democracy. Um, I will also say that, for all of the surprising capitulations we've seen at the elite level in terms of traditional media outlets that have settled lawsuits that Trump has brought rather than fight them in court, and the universities that have signed settlement agreements as well. One thing that is giving me a lot of hope is that I think you are also seeing a lot of popular resistance, not necessarily on the elite level, but the massive protests that we saw last month, the election results that we got last week. There are a lot of reasons to think that normal, everyday people in this country do not like what is happening, understand what is at stake, understand the importance of their rights, and are doing what they can to push back.
Yeah, so we're talking about protests by the masses. How can you see this country moving forward in the future to address all this backsliding in addition to popular protests?
Well, it's going to be a long road, but I think, protest opens the space for further action. So, the protest in itself is a way of showing people that you are not alone in being upset about what's happening and disagreeing with it. And it also creates moments for people to organize communities and give them a next step, give them something to do, whether that is knocking on doors for a political candidate or starting to organize for change in their local communities. And I think we're already seeing that happen everywhere. I think elections continue to be a really important part of this. Voting is not everything, but it's a significant part of a democracy and sustaining a democracy. So we're now about a year out from the 2026 midterm congressional elections. So, leaning into that, supporting whatever candidate, um, really speaks to you the most, doing what you can to volunteer for them. That's another way forward. But also, I think just continuing to stay informed and to educate yourself on what is happening and talking about it with your own network, with your own friends and loved ones, is another thing that we can do together. In terms of longer term rebuilding, it will be years at least. It will be a long time before we've managed to repair all of this damage. And some of this is going to have to happen in terms of new legislation being passed to better protect our rights from this kind of dangerous pressure from the government, ways to sort of cabin in the government's powers and the government's ability to make those sorts of threats, which is something that I hope a future Congress will take up.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all the questions that I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the great questions.